September 20th, 1944. Sommy Hill, France. A German Panzer commander scanned the morning sky through his cupola hatch, watching for the inevitable. American fighter bombers, the Thunderbolts, and Mustangs that had been systematically destroying Wehrmacht armor across France since D-Day. What he didn't expect, what no German tanker could have anticipated, was the tiny fabric-covered aircraft diving toward his column at barely 100 miles per hour, 6 bazooka tubes bristling from its wings like the quills of an angry porcupine. The Piper L-4 Cub was not a weapon of war. It was a liaison aircraft, a glorified civilian trainer pressed into military service for artillery spotting and observation with a 65-horsepower engine barely stronger than a modern lawn mower, a maximum speed slower than most cars on a highway, and a structure made of steel tubing covered in fabric that a good pocket knife could penetrate. It had no business hunting tanks. But Major Charles Carpenter, a high school history teacher from Illinois who had never imagined becoming a warrior, was about to prove that audacity and innovation could transform the impossible into the inevitable. The story of how a history teacher armed the world's most harmless aircraft with anti-tank rockets and terrorized the German army begins not with military genius or engineering brilliance, but with sheer frustration and the uniquely American belief that any problem can be solved with enough creativity and firepower. Charles Carpenter had been teaching history at a high school in Illinois when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Born on August 29, 1912 in Edgington, Illinois, he was 29 years old, married with 2 children, and could have avoided military service entirely. But Carpenter, like thousands of American men in December 1941, felt the pull of duty stronger than the comfort of safety. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in early 1942, hoping to become a fighter pilot, imagining himself in the cockpit of a Mustang or Thunderbolt, engaging German fighters over Europe. The reality was less glamorous. Carpenter's age and the Army's needs directed him toward liaison aviation, the unglamorous, often overlooked branch of military aviation that flew small observation planes for artillery spotting, reconnaissance, and courier duties. He was assigned to fly the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, the military version of the Piper J-3 Cub, America's most popular civilian training aircraft. The L-4 was not designed to inspire confidence in combat. It weighed only 640 to 765 pounds empty, roughly the same as a small motorcycle. Its Continental 0173 engine produced exactly 65 horsepower, less power than many World War I fighters. Maximum speed was approximately 87 to 92 miles per hour in level flight, slower than a modern highway speed limit. The aircraft had no armor, no guns, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single rifle bullet through the fabric fuselage or the pilot's unprotected body could end a mission instantly. Carpenter arrived in Europe in July 1944, assigned to the 4th Armored Division. His unit was in France supporting General George Patton's Third Army as it raced across the country following the breakout from Normandy. Carpenter's job was simple: fly ahead of advancing American forces, spot German positions, direct artillery fire, and report enemy movements. It was important work, critical even, but it was not combat, at least not in the traditional sense. Flying low and slow over enemy territory in an unarmed fabric aircraft was its own kind of terror. German infantry would fire at the little observation planes with rifles and machine guns. Anti-aircraft gunners, though usually focused on higher altitude threats, would occasionally take shots at the Cubs for target practice. The pilots had no defense except evasion, dodging, weaving, staying low enough to use terrain for cover, but high enough to see enemy positions. Carpenter flew these missions daily through August and September 1944, watching American armor advance and German forces retreat. But he also watched something else. He watched German tanks escape. When American infantry encountered enemy armor, they would call for air support. Thunderbolts or other fighter bombers would arrive, sometimes if they were available, if the weather cooperated. if the target could be clearly identified, but often the tanks would be gone by the time the fast movers arrived, disappeared into woods or villages where aerial attack was difficult. Carpenter, circling overhead in his slow, low cub, could see exactly where the German armor was hiding. He could see the tanks that American ground forces couldn't reach, the panzers that artillery couldn't hit because forward observers lacked direct line of sight. He had the perfect vantage point, the ideal position to attack, but he had no weapons. The frustration gnawed at him. A history teacher turned pilot, Carpenter understood that wars were won through innovation and adaptation. The great military leaders throughout history, the subject he had taught for years, had succeeded not by following doctrine blindly, but by recognizing opportunities and seizing them with whatever tools were available. In September 1944, Carpenter approached his commanding officer with an idea that seemed on its face completely insane. He wanted to mount bazookas on his Piper Cub. The M1A1 bazooka, officially designated the 2.36-inch rocket launcher, was America's primary infantry anti-tank weapon. Introduced in 1942, it fired a rocket-propelled shaped charge warhead, capable of penetrating up to 4 inches of armor at optimal range, enough to destroy most German tanks if the shot hit critical areas like the turret ring, engine deck, or side armor. The weapon was effective, portable, and available in large quantities. It was also designed to be fired from a soldier's shoulder, not from an aircraft traveling at 70 miles per hour. Carpenter's commanding officer was skeptical. The idea violated every principle of liaison aviation. The L-4 was not a combat aircraft. It had no weapons pylons, no firing mechanisms, no armor to protect against return fire. Adding rockets would add weight, potentially affecting the already marginal performance of the underpowered aircraft. Worse, firing rockets from a fabric-covered plane seemed likely to either set the aircraft on fire or tear it apart from the recoil and blast. But Carpenter was persistent. He pointed out that the L-4's slow speed was actually an advantage for rocket attacks. Slower aircraft provided more stable firing platforms and longer target acquisition time. The fabric construction, while fragile, was also lightweight, meaning even with added weapons, the aircraft would still fly. Most importantly, he argued that the psychological impact of even a few successful tank kills would be worth the risk. His superiors, recognizing that innovation had driven many American successes in the war, gave him permission to try, unofficially, experimentally, and entirely at his own risk. Carpenter and his ground crew, mechanics who had been maintaining Cubs, not arming warplanes, began the modification process. They acquired 6 bazooka launcher tubes. The challenge was mounting them to the aircraft in a way that allowed firing without destroying the plane. They fabricated simple tubular racks that attached to the wing struts on both sides of the fuselage, 3 launchers per side. Each tube was angled slightly downward to provide the proper trajectory for ground attack. Electrical firing mechanisms were installed, connected to a trigger mounted on the control stick within easy reach of the pilot's thumb. The system was crude, lacking the sophisticated aiming systems of purpose-built attack aircraft, but it was functional. The rockets themselves were M63 high-explosive anti-tank rounds, each weighing 312 pounds and carrying a shaped charge warhead designed to create a focused jet of superheated metal upon impact. The shaped charge worked through the Monroe effect. Upon detonation, the hollow cone of explosive created a jet of molten copper traveling at velocities exceeding 25,000 feet per second, hot enough and fast enough to punch through armor plate like a blowtorch through butter. The first test firing occurred in mid-September at a makeshift range behind American lines. Carpenter loaded all 6 tubes, taxied his modified Cub to the end of a dirt strip, and took off. At 500 feet altitude, he rolled into a shallow dive toward a knocked-out German half-track that served as a target. At 300 at range, close enough to clearly identify the target, but far enough to avoid ground fire in combat, he pressed the firing button. The rockets ignited with tremendous force. The electrical ignition fired all 6 rockets simultaneously. The blast and smoke momentarily obscured his vision. The recoil, lighter than expected due to the rocket motors, sustained burn, reducing the impulse shock, pushed the nose up slightly, but didn't threaten control. The fabric covering on the wings rippled from the exhaust, but didn't tear or burn. The rockets found the general target area. 2 hit the half-track directly. The shaped charges detonated with sharp cracks, punching holes through the vehicle's armor. The test was a success. Word of Carpenter's armed cub spread quickly through the 4th Armored Division. Other pilots were skeptical. Infantry commanders were curious and tankers were desperate for any additional fire support that could suppress enemy armor. Carpenter named his aircraft Rosie the Rocketer and flew his first combat mission with the rocket-equipped Cub in September 1944. Flying his usual reconnaissance patrol, Carpenter spotted a column of German vehicles moving through a tree line approximately 2 mi ahead of advancing American forces. Among the trucks and half-tracks were German tanks, medium Panzers armed with 75mm guns and frontal armor thick enough to resist most American anti-tank weapons at range. Carpenter radioed the coordinates to American artillery, but the tanks were in defilade behind a ridge. Artillery couldn't hit them without direct observation for adjustment, which would take time the Germans weren't giving. The column was moving quickly, clearly attempting to escape before American armor arrived. Carpenter made his decision. He circled around to approach from the east, putting the morning sun behind him. At 1,000 feet altitude, he rolled into his attack dive, the tiny Cub descending at a shallow angle to keep airspeed low enough for controlled flight must have appeared utterly harmless to the German soldiers below, if they noticed it at all. At 400 its range, Carpenter pressed the firing button. All 6 rockets rippled off the launch tubes in less than a second, trailing smoke as they streaked toward the German column. The German vehicles never saw the threat from above. Some rockets missed, impacting in the field beside the road. Others struck vehicles in the column. A half-track was hit, detonating against its thin side armor and transforming the vehicle into a fireball that killed everyone inside. Instantly, at least 1 tank was damaged. The shaped charge penetrated armor where it was most vulnerable. The top armor where German tanks were most exposed. Engine fires spread rapidly. The crew abandoned the damaged tank, scrambling out of hatches. American ground forces arriving shortly after found the burning wreckage and captured stunned German soldiers who couldn't explain how they'd been destroyed by what appeared to be a civilian sport plane. The mission report reached division headquarters within hours. Carpenter's innovation, the idea that had seemed ridiculous just days earlier, had proven itself in combat. The Army Air Forces authorized continued use of the modified aircraft. Other pilots volunteered to fly what some were already calling tank-busting Cubs. But Carpenter himself would be the program's most notable practitioner. Over the following months, he would fly numerous combat missions, becoming one of the most unlikely tank hunters in American military history. The Germans, initially baffled by the attacks, soon learned to respond to the small observation planes that had previously been ignored as nuisances. German troops began to recognize the threat posed by these modified liaison aircraft carrying anti-tank rockets. They appeared suddenly, struck without warning, and disappeared before effective countermeasures could be deployed. Carpenter developed his tactics through trial, error, and the natural teacher's instinct to analyze and improve. He learned that the optimal attack profile was a shallow dive from 800 to 1,000 feet, starting the run from behind or to the side of the target to avoid frontal machine gun fire. He learned that firing at ranges between 300 and 400 yards provided the best balance between accuracy and safety, close enough for his crude sighting system to be effective, far enough to avoid most small arms fire. He learned that German tanks were most vulnerable from above and behind. The top armor on most Panzers was between 15 and 30 millimeters thick, far thinner than the frontal armor, which could exceed 100 millimeters on heavier tanks. The engine deck was particularly vulnerable. A rocket hit that would almost guarantee a mobility kill, even if it didn't completely destroy the tank. Most importantly, Carpenter learned to recognize the difference between targets worth attacking and targets worth avoiding. Heavy tanks, like the Tiger, with their thick armor and powerful weapons, were dangerous, even for his nimble cub. Their machine guns could track targets effectively, and their armor could sometimes resist the shape-charged warheads if the angle wasn't optimal. Carpenter focused on medium tanks and light vehicles, whereas rockets had proven most effective. By October 1944, Carpenter's reputation had spread beyond his division. Soldiers began calling him Bazooka Charlie, a nickname that captured both the audacity and the absurdity of his mission. Here was a high school history teacher flying a fabric-covered aircraft designed for observation, armed with infantry weapons, hunting German tanks across France and into Germany. The psychological impact on German forces was disproportionate to the actual number of kills. Carpenter's missions, while effective, weren't single-handedly destroying panzer divisions, but the fear and uncertainty his attacks created disrupted German operations in ways that numbers alone couldn't measure. Tank crews already stressed by fuel shortages, constant air attacks from fighter bombers, and the grinding retreat across France now had to worry about threats from aircraft they had previously ignored. German anti-aircraft crews focused on higher-altitude bombers, and faster fighter bombers struggled to adapt to the slow-flying Cubs. Engaging them required different tactics, lower gun elevations, slower tracking speeds, and accepting that the small aircraft's low altitude made them difficult targets against ground clutter. The psychological stress of being attacked by what should have been harmless observation planes added to the general challenges German forces increasingly felt. Carpenter continued flying reconnaissance and attack missions through the fall of 1944 as American forces advanced. The missions became more dangerous as German air defenses, even in retreat, remained lethal. The Fabric Cub offered no protection against the increasing density of anti-aircraft fire over German territory. During one engagement near Aurore, France in early October 1944, during major tank battles in the region, Carpenter spotted German armored forces and engaged them. Weather conditions were poor, low clouds, and intermittent rain, which had grounded most American fighter bombers. But the same weather that kept Thunderbolts and Mustangs on the ground was perfect for Carpenter's low-level operations. He attacked German vehicles, firing his rockets and causing damage and disruption to the enemy formation. Machine gun fire followed him, bullets punching through the fabric of his wings and fuselage. But the little Cub kept flying. Carpenter cleared the area and radioed results to American ground forces. His aircraft sustained battle damage on multiple occasions. His ground crew would count bullet holes in the aircraft through wings, fuselage, tail, and within inches of the cockpit. Control cables were damaged. The fuel tank was hit without igniting the gasoline. Each time the crew patched the damage and prepared the aircraft for the next mission. Carpenter was eventually wounded in combat. He was severely wounded by anti-aircraft fire and crash-landed in friendly territory. American medics reached him and evacuated him to a field hospital. He survived, but his combat flying days were over. The wounds were too severe for him to return to flight status. Historical records credit Carpenter with destroying or immobilizing several German armored vehicles during his combat missions. The exact number varies by source, but verified accounts confirm at least 2 Panther tanks immobilized and several other armored vehicles destroyed or damaged. He flew numerous combat missions in a fabric-covered observation plane that the Army never intended to use as a weapons platform. The official recognition came later. Carpenter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his innovation and courage. Citations that noted both his tactical success and his pioneering role in developing new combat techniques. His ground crew received commendations for their work modifying and maintaining an aircraft that was never designed for the punishment it endured. The technical specifications of Carpenter's weapon system, analyzed in retrospect, revealed how improbable his success truly was. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper had a maximum takeoff weight of approximately 002 to 300 pounds, including pilot fuel and equipment. Each bazooka launcher tube weighed approximately 15 pounds. Each rocket weighed 312 pounds. Fully loaded with 6 tubes and 6 rockets, Carpenter's modification added roughly 120 pounds to the aircraft, a significant percentage of its maximum takeoff weight. This additional weight reduced the already marginal performance of the 65 horsepower engine. Maximum speed dropped. Rate of climb decreased. Range was reduced because the heavier aircraft burned more fuel. Takeoff distance increased because the underpowered engine needed more runway to accelerate the heavier mass. Yet, despite these performance penalties, the modified Cub remained flyable and crucially effective. The slow speed that seemed like a disadvantage actually provided a stable firing platform. The lightweight structure that seemed fragile proved surprisingly resilient. Bullet holes through fabric, while alarming, rarely caused catastrophic failure. The simple construction meant that battle damage could often be repaired quickly with basic tools and materials. The M6A3 rockets themselves were remarkably effective given their infantry origin. The shaped charge warhead designed to be fired at ranges under 100 yards from a shoulder-mounted launcher performed well when fired from aircraft at 3 to 400 yd. The stabilizing fins kept the rockets flying relatively straight despite being launched from a moving platform. The electrical firing system, though crude, proved reliable even in combat conditions. The fabric covering of the L-4's wings and fuselage proved reasonably resistant to the rocket exhaust. The flash and heat from 6 simultaneously firing rockets should, by conventional engineering wisdom, have ignited or severely damaged the fabric. But the brief duration of the rocket motor burn, less than half a second, and the positioning of the launch tubes away from direct contact with the fabric meant that damage was minimal. Carpenter's success demonstrated a principle that would become increasingly important in modern warfare, that weapons platforms didn't need to be purpose-built for specific missions if creative adaptation could achieve the desired effect. The L-4 Cub was never meant to be a tank killer, but when armed with the right weapons and flown by a pilot willing to accept enormous risk, it became one. The psychological dimension of Carpenter's missions extended beyond German concerns to American morale. Soldiers on the ground watching the little fabric plane dive toward German armor and emerge, trailing smoke and rocket exhaust, found inspiration in the sheer audacity of it. Here was a high school teacher in an observation plane taking the fight directly to enemy tanks. The story spread through American units. Soldiers who had never seen Carpenter or his Cub knew about Bazooka Charlie. The nickname became well known, a symbol of American ingenuity and courage. In a war increasingly defined by massive industrial production and overwhelming material superiority, Carpenter represented something more personal, the individual warrior using intelligence and creativity to overcome significant odds. After the war, Carpenter returned to Illinois and resumed his life. He died on March 22, 1966, at the age of 53. His daughter later preserved documentation of his service, including letters, photos, and official records that verified his combat achievements when some questioned whether the stories were true. He was buried with military honors in Edgington Cemetery in Edgington, Illinois. His legacy remained as one of World War II's most remarkable examples of individual initiative and creative problem-solving in combat. The surviving L-4 Cubs that saw service in a world